for attending our March event here for the Wisconsin SharePoint user group. Today we're going to talk about forms, workflow, Power Platform, Nintex, all the good stuff. So in our January meeting, we had a lot of discussion on, kind of what the community and our attendees here are working on these days, and a lot of it's form and workflow, right? A lot of InfoPath replacements, trying to understand, what to do next with that, trying to understand Power Platform, and we also thought bringing in other tools like Nintex is good for everyone to understand, know about in the field, because it's definitely in use in a lot of places. So right before we get going on that, I just wanted to also say our May event. So we've worked to get our May event, started and planned. So on the screen here are some of the save the date details. So it will be the third Wednesday of May. So that's May 18th coming up. We're going to move the time to the afternoon instead of the morning. So, please note the time change overall. And then why we're doing that is twofold. One, we want to have an in-person event, but we don't need everyone there. We get it. Schedules, whatever, comfort level, whatever you need, we're going to do both. So but we're going to talk about the hybrid works solution. So most of us, or a lot of us, are seeing hybrid work becoming, part of every day, right? So we've got some people in the office, some people at home. You're in the office and at home. Maybe you're 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. So we definitely see the future being a little different than kind of going into the pandemic with some of these tools and solutions. So thanks to our gracious hosts at AVI Systems in Milwaukee area. Our Milwaukee area will have an in-person event. They have an awesome setup for physical Teams rooms and beyond there that the attendees in person can experience. Yet we'll still have the virtual side of the call as well, so that if you can't make it in person, if you're in different geographic area, you can also attend. To get you to attend, though, we are sponsoring a happy hour in SharePoint and facility tours at AVI, because I was just there yesterday, and it's a great setup. You can see different rooms of different sizes, see how that might work for your organization, and really immerse yourself in it, right? Talking about it, watching a webinar on a physical room is a little different than being in the physical room and just feeling it out. So more to come here. It's save the date today. We're going to post it on Meetup as soon as we can to get some attendance and hopefully make it a nice, big, fun event. We haven't been in person in a long time. I haven't seen a lot of you in person in a long time, and it would be great to do that again. So more to come on that. Early and often we'll be communicating overall. That being said, Terry is from Nintex, and we'll jump right in. And Terry, if you want to go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for the introduction there. I love the idea of the hybrid topic for the next meeting that you guys are having. I'm going to say about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, my colleagues and I have about 12 folks that I work with. We do all the same thing. And we all shared our setups at home, and we did a little video recording of, how many monitors do you have, and where are they, and what camera do you use, and like a green screen background. Some of us use that. And anyways, it was kind of a fun exercise, because that hybrid work environment, I mean, we probably all stepped up our game on our home setup over the last 2 years, but it was kind of a fun activity, because I've got some really good ideas for my colleagues as far as what they're using. I even use this little Stream Deck thing now, where I can bring in sounds and change the video and change setup. And anyways, it's really fun to be able to do that kind of stuff. So I love the topic. But enough about that. So let's talk about today's topic. So I've titled this The Art of the Possible with Forms and Workflow. And this is going to be kind of the Nintex version of it. I think if you invite a vendor to the party, you're probably going to get the vendor perspective on it. But at the end of the day, I'm hoping that you're going to get a lot of just little nuggets that come out of this. Yes, it'll be kind of the vendor angle. You'll see some of our Nintex capabilities in this session, but I'm hoping you're getting a bunch of nuggets out of this information or out of this session that you can apply to any platform that you're using, whether it's Nintex or not. So my objective is to kind of keep it somewhat agnostic, but kind of showing the Nintex version of that. But art of the possible. So we're just going to go over a couple different things or a lot of different things that we get in here. So my focus on this particular session, I'm jump into who I am, who's Nintex. You'll see just a bit of marketing, and then we're just going to get right into some capabilities and some fun stuff. So pretty straightforward agenda. I would absolutely love it today if you guys don't mind, interrupt me along the way as we're doing this session. Treat it as if we're together in the same room. Somebody raises their hand and says, hey, I got a question. Jump right in, interrupt me along the way, raise your hand, and do that. So I'd love this to kind of be a collaborative session, not as much lecture. So feel free to jump in and interrupt me along the way as we get into this. So who am I? I'm Terry Simson. I'm a solution engineer over at Nintex. I kind of fell in love with SharePoint and fell in love with Nintex almost at the same time. About 14 years ago, it was in 2008. Of course, it was all MOS 2007 on-prem, and that's all it was at the time. And really kind of cut my teeth growing up on the technology side as a project manager, doing a lot of SharePoint implementation. So love the platform, kind of fell in love with Nintex at the same time. I spent about 9 years on the consulting side of the business doing a lot of implementations and joined Nintex in this role about 5 years ago. So really love the platform and SharePoint kind of together and where process automation is kind of going as far as that's concerned. So Nintex is who I work for. You know, our objective is really to transform the way that people work through process intelligence and automation. So we've been around a number of years, been around the SharePoint community. You ran into us at a Ignite conference or SharePoint Fest or different user groups like you guys have here. So really enjoy working at Nintex. And then this will be the last piece of the marketing part of this as far as all of our capabilities that we have. I'm going to focus on forms and workflow today. That's going to be the primary piece of our conversation. We do have other capabilities that we've added on over the years. ProMap is the way you can come in and document a process. It's kind of an alternative to Visio. Microsoft actually uses ProMap a good bit with the documentation of processes. And we've even added on a discovery capability in the last month or two. And I won't get into RPA or document generation or e-signature or any of these other ones today, but we're going to focus on workflow and forms capabilities within the platform. And again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we've added on that discovery and acquired a new RPA capability, which I'm pretty excited to get into a little later this year onto the platform. But here's, I think, why we're talking about all this. And I think all the companies that you're working for today or that are represented here today, there's a lot of pressure to automate processes and digitally transform. And it's really changed over the last 2 years, but there's still a big focus on cost reduction out there. It's always been something that organizations have focused on and continue to be out there. Risk and compliance has become much more popular over the years just because there's a lot more risk in the business, especially from a compliance and audit perspective, that you need to pay attention to. And a lot of those risks, in order to solve them or reduce the risk, technology is being implemented in order to help drive the process consistently. And online forms and workflow automation and where that data lives, that's a big part of that and reducing that risk and helping out the compliance folks. Also, increased productivity is always a focus, again, to be able to do things faster, more efficiently, and then ultimately customer service. And I feel like this is coming back a lot. I think customer service has always been a driving force for organizations, but organizations are starting to focus on how automation can help with the service experience. And the pandemic's helped with this. I'm starting to see a big shift with customers that we work with, even in like something like the healthcare space, where when you walk into the physician's office, they don't hand you that clipboard and pen as much anymore. I've run into a lot of scenarios where I'm using my own device to fill out an online form, hit submit, and I don't have to touch the clipboard or the mouse or the pen that they give to me. In a lot of instances, I'm doing that, filling out that form before I even come the day of the visit. So that way, when I show in, I literally just kind of check in. So that service approach is really important and is really driving kind of the bottom line for a lot of organizations that are out there. But there's a few reasons why I think a lot of people are struggling to transform. And some of it's really lack of alignment as far as automation goals. If any organizations on this call are representative of this statistic, that would mean that less than 20% of their processes are automated, meaning there's a big opportunity. 70-80% of the processes that you have are available to be automated. And you can walk into any organization today, and on the average, that's typically the case. And hopefully your organizations aren't representative of that, but typically there's a large opportunity for that. Also, lack of resources. A lot of organizations report, or individuals within organizations talk about how there's a shortage in IT skill sets and capabilities. I've been to a lot of different companies where they're using citizen developer tools like Nintex, like 365, where average individuals in the business can go out and automate processes. There's just a lot of demand. That's why you see these tools becoming so popular, in order for the business to be able to do their own kind of stuff. And IT just can't keep up with the demand, whether it's a resource demand of as far as having enough people to build the things, or a lack of resources from a financial budget allocation. We see both of those challenges in a lot of scenarios. And then what we're going to talk about today is lack of capabilities. You're probably working at an organization or know of organizations that lack modern capabilities when it comes to forms and workflow. It may be that you're still on-prem with SharePoint, and that could be a lot of driving factors. It could be the type of industry you're in, banking, financial services, healthcare. A lot of those organizations will stay on-prem for a long time, and they're very slow to move to the cloud. And due to that, they're lacking a lot of the cloud capabilities, the latest and greatest functionality. And it may be that a lot of you are on older technologies, still leveraging things like InfoPath Forms, which is going away. You've probably had multiple presentations on that in the users group. But we'll talk about that a little bit today, and how the current tools a lot of times don't meet the needs of the organization. And that's what we're going to get into today, is some alternatives to kind of upgrade some of those capabilities and look at alternatives to getting into that. So the journey from this old into the new can be a journey. It's not an overnight, I'm just going to go over the weekend and acquire a couple technologies and go from there. It is a journey, and it's a slow process to get there. So identifying what you have today, maybe you've got some of that on-prem and you're looking to go with SharePoint Online. You might still be using SharePoint Designer workflows. Well, how do you get those moved over? Maybe you're leveraging the SharePoint Workflow Manager even within 365, and that's going to have a sunset date at some point. So how do you prepare for that? Or even InfoPath Forms and getting those moved over. And so how do we get those things upgraded? I'll talk a little bit about that today. How you can move your SharePoint Designer workflows over, how you can leverage things like a PDF converter to automatically convert some of that stuff. Do some testing in order to make sure that things are ready to go to production, and then go through some final steps in order to kind of launch things and get them ready. So it's definitely a journey that you go on. And a lot of you on this call were probably accustomed to that. So I'm going to spend the rest of our time here together in the actual capabilities that we have at Nintex and show you a few things as far as what you can do and ways that you can work with things. around forms and workflow. Well, one of the first things I wanted to highlight at Nintex, this is a tool that we make available for free. We've got what we call a gallery website where you can download this. But some of you still may have SharePoint Designer workflows that you need to migrate to another location, and we make it easy for you to do this, especially in the Nintex stack. And so you can take those Designer, maybe you still have SharePoint Designer 2010 or 2013 workflows. You can convert those over to Office 365 or an on-prem Nintex environment or Nintex Workflow Cloud. So pretty easy to be able to come and select one of those. Literally just go out and find that file. We've got some good directions on getting to this, and I've got a little test workflow we can work with. And the thing that I love about this little converter that we built is once you hit convert, it's going to open up that file, and it's going to look at how many actions you have that you've built within SharePoint Designer. So you'll see in here, we've got 6 of them where we're logging instance details, basically kind of logging SharePoint history stuff. Some conditional branches, we've got some parallel actions, and then we've got 6 emails that we're sending. And it makes it really easy just to click on import and get this converted over into a Nintex Workflow Cloud tenant, so that we can literally just come into Nintex Workflow Cloud at this point, and I'll hit the refresh screen here, and we should see our new workflow show up, and you'll see the skeleton of it. So I'll go ahead and select this test workflow. Now I'm on East Coast time, so it's 21 minutes after 10 here. And then I'll open this up, and you'll see the skeleton of the workflow. So instead of seeing it in this SharePoint Designer view, we now see this nice, structured, easy to use workflow. And all those actions came over, at least the skeleton of the actions. And you'll have to finish configuring this. But what's cool about it is those logged instance details, you'll be able to click on those, branching by condition, the sending of the email, all those actions are now over here. Now you will have to go in and bring in what you actually want to log. So you'll type in your text or reference the data model that you have in order to get it in here. But it's very, very quick to kind of accelerate that process if you've got a SharePoint Designer workflow and you want to bring it over. And we make that available here on the gallery website for you to download. If you want to see it. Matter of fact, I'll go ahead and put into the chat session here. I'll post a link to the gallery in order to see that. But over here on the left-hand side, you'll see a lot of templated workflows or processes that you'll have out here available, and then you can just kind of click on the tools section and download that converter that's right here. So we make it free to you, be able to download it and then convert those items over, but really straightforward for that, but kind of a fun little thing to show off. Now for today's session, I wanted to jump in and show you a really cool capability when it comes to forms and bringing those into a designer canvas and building them out like Nintex. I'm going to go out here and create a brand new workflow, and at the start of this workflow, I want to show you how we can go and build a form, because I know a lot of you have PDF forms or InfoPath forms and you want to bring those over. And so one of the things you can do is choose the trigger for your workflow over here. And we've got several triggers because you might want to trigger it based upon an event somewhere else. We'd call that component workflow, or have a scheduled workflow, or even trigger it based upon an event. I'm going to show you that here in a few minutes, based upon like a new item being added into SharePoint list, or a new document that's uploaded to OneDrive, or maybe a new item that's in Dynamics. So you have those capabilities. But I wanted to show you this form converter here real quick. Now, keep in mind this form builder that we have, you can make these forms available to anonymous users or authenticated. So if you've got a form, you want to hide it behind a username and password, you can do that, or you can make it available to anonymous users. So if you've got like a job application form, partner, vendor, customer, and they don't have a username or password, you can make it available to them. But I'm going to click Design Form, and this is where we're going to come and build out this particular form. Now, normally you would build out the form and you would just drag the elements on the screen and kind of build it out in a manual way. you'd be able to click on those actions and configure it. I'll show you a little bit more here in a minute when I go to build one. But I wanted to show you this capability of starting the form from a PDF instead of manually building it. And so we've got this capability. Click on it, and you're going to import the PDF. Now, when we talk about the PDF, there are a lot of different PDF types that you can bring in. Now, this PDF example is a PDF that started out as a Word document. Someone saved it as a PDF along the way, and that's how we got to the content. But keep in mind that this PDF could be a screenshot. Maybe you've got an InfoPath form. You could take a screenshot of the InfoPath form, save that screenshot as a PDF and use it. Or maybe you're using another form technology, and you can take a screenshot of that as well. But once you open the PDF, you're going to see it over here on the left-hand side of the page, that PDF. The form that we're building is going to be on the right-hand side of the page. And all you got to do is kind of lasso your content or highlight it that you want to bring over. I'm going to take this section here, and as soon as I let go of the mouse, it builds the form for you automatically on the right-hand side of the page. Really quick, really easy to be able to build that form. And the thing that you'll notice is that when we jump in here, the student name, that's a text box, teachers, a text box, but down here, the date of absence is actually a date picker now, because we got some nice logic built into this so that when it comes in here, we're going to leverage the date picker. Or the phone number, let's go ahead and put that in a phone number format. So I can type in my number here, and it's in the proper format, or at least we're giving the user some guidance. And even something like the teacher signature, which was just a line over here, we're bringing in the signature control so that we could capture the signature on the page. So you can kind of course correct these controls as needed. But it's a great way to accelerate the process of building the form. And I'm going to click finish so that we can finish building the form in our canvas over here and kind of clean it up. Because you'll see things like the parent's name here. It brought in that line. So I'm going to need to remove that line because I don't want that showing up. So we've got parent's name kind of a little bit cleaner. And then we can come and drag these fields side by side. You know, put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns across, you know, clean up some of the text up here at the top, maybe take our title, center it, make it a little bit bigger as far as the font is concerned. A lot of ways that you can kind of dress up this particular form to get it to look the way that you would like to see it and ready for your end users there. So just wanted to show you that neat capability to be able to accelerate that process of building out the form. And I love this because we now have our data model just by importing that form. And we've got text fields, date fields. We've got a file field here for the signature. And you can add additional fields or variables in here as you wish, but it's just a great way to have that data model. And now we can start to work on the workflow side with this particular data. So really, really easy to be able to go and build out a workflow like that. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And I wanted to show you that form converter, and we'll open up a new workflow here and get going. And again, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have any questions along the way. Now, when we go to build a new workflow, I wanted to highlight something here when it comes to building the form. Actually, a couple things as we build out the form. Again, I'm going to make an anonymous form here, and I wanted to show you how we could build this form and connect it into SharePoint. So let's go ahead and add some data in here. Well, first thing I want to do, let's put some branding on here. So let's put an image on the form, and we'll put a label out here. I'm going to grab your logo for the SharePoint users group and stick it on there. And then let's put, make this an event registration form. So I'm just going to type in event registration. We'll center that. Let's give it a font here. Let's say 28. We'll make it bold. And that image is a little big right there. So what I'm going to do is kind of expand the title and kind of push that image to the side as I keep hitting expand. But let's capture some information. Let's go ahead and get a text box here for a name and an email. And I'm going to click on those and go ahead and update these. So let's do let's do full name. Let's do email address. And by the way, we can make these required or read only, you know, those type of things. You can put all that out there. Also, let's put a box here for phone number here. So just a very basic registration form that we want to leverage. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And by the way, we could put rules on here as well. Really easy to add rules. These rules are so easy to configure. You can just kind of put these if type things. So if first name or full name is empty, then I could take the phone number field and modify the visibility and hide it if you wanted to. Really easy to kind of build out these forms here, or the rules in here. Let me cancel out of that one. But once we've designed that form, let's hit apply changes, we can now come back to the workflow and start to do something with the data. So I'm a big fan of integrating this with other systems of record. So Nintex kind of sits right in the middle of all your applications, and you can start to work with it. So I know SharePoint's a big one that you guys work with. So we have all these SharePoint Online touch points where we can integrate with it. And by the way, it's not just SharePoint Online. You can also do this for SharePoint on-prem as well. Let's see here. We've got actually SQL on-prem, on-prem web services that you want to call, but then also SharePoint on-prem as well. So we have a gateway service that will connect Nintex Workflow Cloud down to your on-prem environment. So it provides a secure connection so that even if you don't have SharePoint Online, you're still in on-prem, you could create, update, you know, read and do those kind of items. But what I want to do is connect this into SharePoint Online, and we want to create an item in SharePoint. So let's grab that create an item there. And to make the connection, it's pretty straightforward. You're going to be able to come out here and just grab your credentials. Leroy Brown is kind of the alias that I use. And then we just simply type in the site. So I'm going to do HTTP. And we use a site called Cephalo is the name of it. SharePoint.com. And what you'll do is click retrieve list. So it's going to log in to that site with those credentials, and it finds all the lists that are out there. And I've got a list out there called event registration. And that list, I've already created it prior to this, but we've got a title field, an email field, and the phone number field out here. So just a basic custom list within SharePoint Online. But now that it's connected to it, we can go ahead and add fields. Now you'll see the required fields show up automatically like title, but I want to add a couple other fields, email and phone number, so that we can take the data from our form and send it into the SharePoint list. So we'll look at our object here. I'm going to make the title the full name, the phone number. Oops. We'll make the phone number the start event here. And then we'll make the email the email. So that way, when the workflow runs, it will take that data and store it in the list. And by the way, we could save the output here and come and update this item a little later if we wanted to as well. So I'm a big fan of this, of creating a little variable here and just call it SharePoint Online info. And it just captures, you know, the list item ID number and all that good stuff. So really handy to be able to do that. But we're going to create that item. Maybe after we create it, we'll assign a task to someone to complete a task. And we'll just say approval, you know, reject, approve. We could design a form related to that approval. Pretty straightforward to be able to do this. I'm just going to kind of leave that. I won't add any of the, well, I add some of the data. We'll take our start event data and go ahead and place it on here. So that way we'll see our full name, we'll see the phone number and the email address there on it. So pretty quick to be able to do that. And then let's just send this notification to whatever email address was supplied to us. And then just say thank you. Thank you. And then let's reference their full name. So that way we call it out and say thank you there. And then we'll just put some text here. So pretty easy to be able to kind of build out a workflow go and create an item in the SharePoint list. And once that item runs, then you could go and do whatever you wanted. So we could integrate with other systems, by the way. We could even come down and maybe do something within, let's say, Teams. Maybe we want to post a message to a channel or do any type of activity. So there's a Teams connectors down here. So we could create a channel, we could create a team, we could change membership to a team if you want to do some governance stuff. But we could bring all those actions over and change the configuration over there as needed. So really, really cool to be able to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and publish this just to show that it works. So let's do the Wisconsin SharePoint user group test here. And I'm going to go ahead and publish this workflow. And then we're going to trigger it and see if it works, and see if it'll create that item and then fire off the notification. And by the way, the form that we just created is publicly available. So if I open this up, we'll see the URL for that form. You could fill it out, you could register, and do whatever you wanted to. Matter of fact, I'll put it in the chat session here if you guys want to see this form filled out in real time. I'm actually going to do this in our workflow testing module here where we could actually test it. Of course, you could test it by filling out the form as well. And I'm going to go ahead and just put my information in here. So Terry Simson, I'll put my email address in here and go ahead and put my phone number in here. And by the way, you don't have to volunteer any information. I'll go ahead and hit submit, and that should create the item in the SharePoint list. And I should, in theory, get the email here in just a second. So this is going to update, and you'll see that the create an item was started. This will refresh every 10 seconds, but if you're impatient like me, you can click refresh. So it created the item, it assigned the task to me, and I should be able to go complete it. So if I go over to the SharePoint list, refresh that, we should see my entry and maybe others. There we go. John entered his. Perfect. I got mine in there. There's the data showing up in the SharePoint list right there for us. So let me click refresh, see if anybody else did. There's another one, Jonathan. He submitted his. So we're in there, and that's working. And now we can go and complete our tasks. So I got the email. So Jonathan, you should have got your email. Now, I just said thank you, Terry Simpson. You'll see the task form. I'll click on that, and we should be able to approve it. Of course, when I approve it, we'll see the read-only data. I'll hit submit, and I didn't put anything else after that. So the workflow should be completed at this point. And just a real quick way to build a workflow. So I'll click refresh, and you'll see that we're complete there. But really straightforward to be able to build a workflow, integrate with a system like SharePoint in that particular example. Now, I want to show you another way to do this. I'm going to create another workflow here real quick, and we could actually do the reverse. So instead of filling out the form and that triggering the workflow, what you could do is come out here and you could have an event-based workflow. So let's do the reverse. If a new item is added into the SharePoint list, let's trigger the workflow. So the event would be new item added to the list or an update, or you could do both, by the way. You could do both of those. And again, we'll do our credentials here just like I did before. follow.sharepoint.com. It'll log into that site with those credentials and again get back our list. So now whenever an item is added as new or is updated within the list, this workflow will trigger and we can tell that workflow to then go do something. So maybe when that workflow kicks off, we will come in here and assign a task, and let's call this the SharePoint Online trigger approval. And then what we'll do is we'll come in here and have our form right here. Now the data that's available to us is down here. So this is our data from SharePoint that we could leverage. So we're going to have some email information in that field. We're going to have an item ID number. We're going to have who modified it last. All that information is going to be in here. Where's the title field? We'll bring that in here too. So you'll see all that in the approval option when we go to see it. And then again, I'm going to assign this task to whoever is in the email field. So when we go to do this, we can go to, got our formula, There's our start event. That's what I was looking for. So let's grab the email address for whoever created that, and then just come in here and say, thank you for triggering the workflow. So we've got all of our data that's in there. So now we should be able to trigger that and have the workflow kick off. So let's go ahead and publish it and see if it works. So we'll do trigger SharePoint Online. We'll do trigger from SharePoint Online. That'll be the name of our workflow, and we'll go ahead and publish it. So in theory, we come back to our SharePoint list after that's published, and we should be able to trigger this. And based upon the trigger, I should get an email at this point. So let's go back to our list. We'll go ahead and create a new item. Let's call this Leroy Brown. And I'm going to use Leroy Brown to follow his email address and then punch in his phone number. So let's make sure that it was published. It was. Now that it's published, we'll go ahead and hit save. New item gets added to the list. Once the new item's added to the list, that triggers the workflow. It'll kick off and should send me an email here in just a second. So it's a great way to leverage Nintex as the workflow engine within SharePoint Online. And also those other triggers could come from other places, OneDrive, you name it. You can kind of do that. And again, lots of systems of record that we connect with over here out of the box. Matter of fact, if you don't see a system represented and you want it to be in here, we call those private connectors or extensions. You can actually build your own extension and bring it in. Any web service call, REST-based, just place it in there and you can call it and it'll go from there. And we don't charge anything for those additional connectors. So if you've got other systems, go ahead and create your own sections in here. And then you can call those other systems of record, which makes it really, really nice to be able to do that and kind of integrate with all your other systems. And then the last thing I'll highlight here is that if you want your workflows to become much more sophisticated or complex, we make it really easy to be able to do that by coming in here and allowing you to branch the workflows out by maybe a stage, like you've got manager approval, maybe you've got VP approval, and at any point you might want to send it through a revise cycle. So really easy to be able to configure that, assign the task to someone. Once the task is complete, change the workflow to a different stage where you can just simply say, hey, let's go to the VP next. Or if it's rejected, let's go through a revision cycle. That way we can send it back to whoever created it. That way the revise person would get assigned a task. And after they complete their task, then they could go and send the workflow back to the manager. It makes it easy to kind of copy these sections. So you could do the same thing for the VP here. Again, rejected, go to revise. If we're done here, we'll exit the little state machine and we can kind of move on. So really, really straightforward to be able to get all of that kind of orchestrated right here in this one location. So I won't go into the weeds much further on all of that. But I will take a pause, see if anybody does have any other questions or wants to raise a hand on some of these items that you see out here. All right, I'm going to take that as a good sign. I'll highlight a couple other features in here as well, because there might be some things that you're wanting to do inside of a workflow that are a little more complex. You may want to convert some values. You might want to pause a workflow for a certain period of time. And by the way, these workflows can run beyond 30 days. They go up to a year. So if you've got a long running process, this is an ideal solution. But you might want to pause the workflow, like if you're going to onboard a new employee and you're waiting for maybe a 30-day review, 60, 90-day review, then you could pause that workflow for that period of time. And also we can work with collections in a real nice way. I know a very common thing to do in Nintex workflows, especially with SharePoint, is you might go out and query a SharePoint list. And when you query that list, you're going to get a bunch of items back from that list, and they come back in the form of a collection. And we can work with that data, because you may want to go out and count and see how many items are in that collection, get a specific item out of it, or maybe remove duplicates out of it, or sort and filter on the collection. So it makes it really easy to work with that. And one of the things I love is this ability to come in here and loop through each of those items inside of a collection. So you could simply go out here and loop through each, and basically it takes each item that you'd have in the SharePoint list, and then you're going to do something with it. And you might be sending out emails or doing a calculation. So anyways, working with those collections is really nice. And then other integrations, you may want to call a web service or query some JSON, do some XML that's in here, or even generate a document. And this has become very popular in a lot of scenarios where you might want to generate a quote or onboarding paperwork. Document generation is a really cool thing that you can do. And especially like in the onboarding of the paperwork, I brought on a new employee, I guess 2 weeks ago now, and the paperwork that he filled out was something like 30 or 40 pages long. But what's cool about our process internally is that we can add multiple templates out here. If you want to have 10, 20 pages or templates, you can bring in those individual Word documents or Excel or PowerPoint documents, whatever they are, and stack those on top of each other, because when that employee is onboarded based upon their role, you might have a different set of documents to fill out. But ultimately, it will output an individual PDF file and create that entire package. But again, multiple templates, meaning multiple Word documents that you're going to bring in. And it makes it really easy to come out here and just tag the data from your workflow or your systems of record and be able to do that. So if you've got your data model here from SharePoint that we see, we could take the email, we could take the created date or any other information that we've got, and we can tag that data inside of that document. So that way, if you come out here and click on it, that ugly looking text inside of the blue box, you just paste it into your Word template, it'll generate the document for you. So really, really cool for that. And then even send it out for signature, because we want to automate that as well. So you'll see different signature capabilities that are in here. Here at Nintex, we now have our own signature capability that's called a SureSign, and you can just go in here and look for that, and you can actually send it off for signature at that point. So that way you can get your digital signature or physical signature even as well, I guess, on the page and sent out. And we've seen a lot of use cases for that. Ever since the pandemic started, it's really accelerated, because there's so much that you need to do as far as sign off and signing documents and doing it remotely. You can do it right here. And we're also seeing a lot of usage of the document generation and signature in a contactless environment. I know we talked about healthcare there at the beginning, or at least I brought it up. And that scenario where you're the new patient and you're given that paperwork to sign, you can just fill out the Nintex form. It would actually generate a package of paperwork, which would be your onboarding paperwork for the physician. And then you could even sign it and put your signature on there as well. So that way they've got one PDF automatically uploaded to their system of record and fully automated in order to be able to do that. And all the receptionist has to do is either send you the link to the URL or put a QR code right there at the desk so that you scan it and start filling out the form. So really, really cool to be able to do all that inside of the Workflow Cloud. Now, I will highlight one or two other things if you don't have any questions at this point before we jump into some final questions and then maybe get into our next presenter. But I did want to show that in here, you can come out and federate this tenant with whatever single sign-on that you're using. I'm assuming most of you are probably using Azure Active Directory as your single sign-on of choice. You'll see here I've got it federated with our Nintex domain, but you can also federate it with other things as well. If you've got some other SAML-based authentication that you want to do, or Okta, or anything, you can kind of federate it with that. That way your user store is being leveraged and your governance model is being leveraged for that. So if someone leaves the organization, they can come out and won't have to worry about them getting access to things that they shouldn't be getting access to. So that's kind of the basics of what I wanted to walk you through today in building out a form, building out a workflow, automating a process, at least from the Nintex perspective. I wanted to highlight that form converter capability. Makes it really quick to move over those InfoPath forms, at least the more simpler InfoPath forms. I know many of you probably have those InfoPath forms that have been turned from a form into an application, is the way I like to term it, where it's a full-fledged application. Obviously, it's not going to bring over all that rules-based logic that you've built into those apps, but I think for basic forms, it makes it quick and easy to kind of bring it over. But let me open it up to see if there's any other questions. That's what I had from a presentation perspective and kind of the Nintex view or the Nintex stance on forms and workflows. So hopefully that's gotten a few nuggets out of that information, but love to hear if you've got any questions or thoughts.
Yeah, no, that was great. And we've talked about this in the past as a group. So I think you're hitting the mark with what we need to see, understand as different organizations are trying to figure this out in the future.
Perfect.
Any questions, anything else people want to see? Otherwise, Drew, I'll get you hopefully started to introduce the next segment as well. But anything else from the group? All right. Well, thank you, Terry.
Perfect.
All right, Drew, you want to go ahead and introduce the second segment as well?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Terry. That was I haven't seen Nintex in a little bit, and that was good to hear, especially on the conversion side. I know that's one where I've talked with people in this world, and that was an important topic. One of the reasons why I reached out to you to kind of shed some light on what you've seen. And I think the other side that's important is all the connector side, right? As we start to talk about Haniel here and what he's going to be going through from a more of a governance aspect, make sure everyone in here is like thinking about what processes that they have today, whether they're using Nintex or not, and now talking more into the Power Platform. How do you manage all of these things? How would you manage it moving to the Power Platform? And we are lucky to have Haniel here, who I worked with now for going on 3 years on it. Not as much as I would like to, but we're actually on the same project now, so I get to finally get some more hands-on with Haniel. But he's gracious enough to come on and help us talk through where he's kind of been in the Power Platform world and how it relates, obviously not directly with Nintex in the same realm here. So Haniel, you don't need too much of an introduction, more than just to kick off for you. But thank you, Haniel. Thank you, definitely, Terry. Thank you for joining this one. Terry, you want to send me your slides, or Terry, and then I will distribute them if anyone needs them as well.
Yeah, I will. I'll share those out, and you guys can leverage them for sure.
Awesome. Haniel, the table's yours, man.
Right.
Awesome. Thanks so much. You guys can hear me?
Yep.
Very nice. Okay. Thanks, Drew, for the intro. Terry, great presentation. I have actually, before Power Platform became a product and was even an idea, I was using Nintex quite a bit. So, it's nice to see how it's been evolving over time and to see where it is today being used a lot. I'm going to focus today, as Drew mentioned, on the Power Platform. It's not going to be technical. What I want to talk about is more around governance. And the reason is that it is something which is important, but often it doesn't get the necessary love it's supposed to get. I'm going to try to make this more conversational. So lots of stuff to go through. If you do have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. Posting messages. I'm not going to monitor as much. I'll get to those at the end. But definitely, if there's anything you want me to touch on more, happy to do so. So as Drew mentioned, I work with him at Protiviti. I've been at the company for about 4 years. I'm an enterprise architect in Business Up in Power Platform. So I lead the global practice for Power Platform. Also have a strong background in SharePoint, Teams, and pretty much a lot of what's under the Microsoft 365 stack. 5 times Microsoft MVP in business application space. And yeah, definitely love to continue the conversation after our meeting today. So I don't think I have to introduce automation at this point. Terry already talked a lot of it. The needs, especially during COVID, have just increased manifold, where people have been removed from the office. All of a sudden, they can't have physical access to documents and other information. And so and even people, right? So being able to automate processes is something that has become even more important. Now, when we're talking about governance, if I were to ask kind of really quickly, percentage-wise, or who governs the Power Platform in your organization if it's using it? Kind of curious to know what the typical answers are. What I find is that obviously it's going to be IT. In some cases, it might be business. Typically, it'll be a hybrid, maybe of both, if you have a governing body set up. But interestingly enough, in a survey that I did, about 30% of companies that have rolled out the Power Platform are actually not actively governing it. So what they're saying is, here are a bunch of tools, go and have fun. It sounds nice. It definitely helps with the citizen developer mentality, but there's also certain risk associated with it. And the reason is because when you start to develop solutions in the Power Platform, you have a lot of capabilities. And even though you may not have a lot of, let's say, access to different systems, even the limited access that you have can have a quite significant negative impact if it's not used properly. So don't think of governance as a big binder that sits somewhere collecting dust on a shelf, but think of it as something that is live, that has to be reviewed and assessed on a regular basis, and it's a way for a company to mitigate risk and avoid potential issues. So for those of you who are new to the Power Platform, it's essentially made up of 5 key components. We have Power Apps, which is a form builder, mobile first, a lot of flexibility in it. You have 2 versions of it, Canvas app, which is, think of it as a Pinterest canvas. You can make it look any way you want. And then you have model-driven app that are more based on the actual data structure. Power Automate, also 2 flavors. You have Power Automate for cloud workflows. And those are running basically inside of your Microsoft data center. And then you have something called Power Automate Desktop. That is your RPA solution. So if you're working, for example, with a legacy system on-prem or even in the cloud that don't have interfaces, or they are green screens or other types of limitations, you can actually build these type of automations using the desktop, which mimics the mouse and the keyboard interactions. Power BI is a visualization tool, so it allows you to really make sense of your data and get insights. It has natural language interpretation, full integration with multiple data sources. You can do mashups. So that's what Power BI provides you. Power Virtual Agents, that is a chatbot tool that you can actually use to build chatbots very quickly without any code. Actually, any of these tools really are low code, no code. And with the Power Virtual Agent, you can literally in minutes stand up a whole chatbot, load up a Q&A data source, and make that available to your users. You can then also integrate it with Power Automate to then do further processing of data, which then opens it up to a whole world of other systems. And then you have Dataverse, which is essentially a cloud-based database. Think of it as something like SQL or Azure SQL. But what it gives you, in addition to just the basic data, is there's security layer, there's a logic layer, and it comes prepackaged with entities that are defined by the common data model, where there's a number of organizations, Microsoft being one of them, Adobe and others, that are defining, let's say you want to build a new database and you want to work with a company. Well, there's an account entity or an account table. What are the common fields? What are the common logic you need to have for that? That's what Dataverse provides you. And that is an underlying component of the data platform. Sorry, the Power Platform. And then with it also you have an ecosystem of probably over 400 connectors today that allow you to connect to whether it's Microsoft or non-Microsoft systems to load, interact, and generate data as you need to. Now, when we talk about governance, typically there are multiple stages to go through. You start with an assessment. What is your current state? What is being used today? This is for those companies where they just start to roll out the Power Platform with no governance, nobody's watching. What's really happening? Are people using it? How are they using it? How much is out there? Are workflows failing? What kind of licensings do we have? So there's a lot of questions that you want to answer that an assessment helps you get to those answers quickly. Then we have the governance and strategy. This is typically where you actually start building out the governance, right? Who is going to be governing it? How are you monitoring it? What are all the bells and whistles, the controls you have to put in place? And how are you making sure that as the company matures and the usage of the Power Platform increases, that the demands are being met and that you have the necessary guardrails to make sure that your users are not misusing the platform in any way. Then you go into governance deployment, which is where you actually start rolling out automation for the sake of governance. So in other words, somebody wants an environment, rather than just turning it on, you may want to go through an approval process where they have to give justifications, and it has to go through automatic deployment rather than IT having to do that work. And then you do governance optimization, and this is where you continuously review, enhance, and adapt the governance to the specific needs. So that's kind of in a nutshell of how we at Protiviti look at governance as a whole strategy, a whole program. Now, I call this presentation assessing your Power Platform from A to Z. Unfortunately, I don't have a Y and a Z, but I will be going through all these different items you see on the screen right now very quickly. I'm going in alphabetic order. There is really no right or wrong order when it comes to governance, because everything here is important. So let's get going. So the first thing is apps. When you start talking about apps and you do an assessment, you want to understand what kind of apps are out there, who's using them, where are they running, in which kind of environment, what kind of a region. Are they built for the right form factor, right? If somebody's building a tablet app and somebody's trying to load it on a phone, it's not going to work very well. What kind of data is being accessed? Who's accessing it? So there's a lot of questions you want to ask yourself about the apps that are being used inside of your tenant. When we start to build the bots, and this is where I start talking about the RPA bots. So it's a great way to access legacy systems. It's a great way to access the systems that are on a server or a different computer. But at the same time, you got to be careful, because that means that that user who's running a bot may potentially expose data through the bot that you don't want it to be exposed, the RPA bot. So there's actual configurations that can be done to group policies and to the systems to restrict or limit what the actual Power Automate desktop bots can do. Custom connectors. So I mentioned before that there is over 400 connectors available today that you can connect to different systems, but there may be cases where you want to build your own custom connector. Let's say that there is an internal system that was developed and you want to build some API hooks into it. So custom connectors is the answer. However, once you build that custom connector, that code has to be hosted somewhere. Typically would be inside of your Azure tenant, but it could also be somewhere else. Once it's published, you want to make sure that people are not just going to go in there, your developers, and start changing the code, which could now negatively impact how these connectors are being used. So again, you got to ask yourself, what are these connectors? Who's building them? How are you controlling the source behind them, or that they're still functioning as they should? Data loss prevention. So this is the idea where you're working with data from your organization. There may be data coming in from other sources. You may have to legitimately send data to other sources outside of the company. That is all legit. But what you want to make sure is that when you're building these kind of solutions, you may not want to mix certain type of connectors or data sources with each other. For example, let's say you have what is called business data, which may be your SharePoint, your Teams, your Outlook, your OneDrive, and then there may be non-business. This could be your social media. It might be another external system like ServiceNow. And you may want to build different workflows for both. but you can actually set up restrictions with data loss prevention that says that when I use SharePoint, I cannot use ServiceNow in the same workflow. It will actually prevent me. And so you want to build those data loss prevention policies for your different environments, but you also have to be careful, because if you're now saying, oh, I just realized there's a whole bunch of workflows in production, let me put in some data loss prevention policies to restrict what I'm doing. If there's any workflow that does not conform to the data loss prevention that is now being applied to the environment, you have effectively suspended that workflow and things are going to start breaking. So you got to be really careful when you're doing an assessment and you're going through this governance exercise to make sure that before rolling things out, you want to assess what is going to be the potential impact. Also, there's something called the default environment. And this is the environment that everybody has access to once you turn on the Power Platform. And by default, it has all the connectors added to it. So one of the recommendations typically is remove all the non-essential connectors. And by non-essential, there's a minimum set of 23 that must remain. And those include the SharePoint, the OneDrive, the Outlook, and there's a reason for that. So Drew, you're a SharePoint person, and I'm sure there's others on the call who are SharePoint people. As you know, with the modern SharePoint experience, you can request approvals inside of your SharePoint libraries and your SharePoint lists. Well, guess what? Those are running on Power Platform behind the scene. So if you were to remove the approval workflows or the SharePoint connectors, you've actually broken your SharePoint environment. That's why those are being restricted in the default. Environment creation. So for companies that are multinational, there is often policies, regulatory policies that need to be put in place around where client or company data is being stored. So if we're in the US, you may have SOX compliance. If you're in Europe, there's GDPR. Other regions have their own rules. You're going to be really careful that if some user is going to go and create an environment that is going to be storing data, that they understand what region it's being created in. Because if it's in the wrong region, you cannot change the region or environment. You actually have to redeploy a new environment and then migrate all the solutions over to it. And you want to make sure that it's being that you're starting in the right region with the data, because otherwise you might get into situations where companies are getting sued. And there was such a lawsuit, I believe it was 1 or 2 years ago, of around $800 million around having data exposed by clients without their explicit consent, because in that country it was not allowed. So big potential implications there. Failures. So failures happen. They're normal. It can be a data source that is disconnected. It can be maybe some bad data being sent to a workflow. What you want to do is you want to monitor your failures on a regular basis. There are different ways of doing it. You can, for example, you can go into your flow environment, or you can look at your Power Platform Center of Excellence dashboard if you have one deployed. But keep an eye on the failures and try to address them. Also, you need to understand that the way that some of these workflows, some of the errors are being reported, it's not immediate. Some of the errors can take sometimes days before you're going to get a digest and say, here's everything that has failed in the last 2 or 3 days. And that might be too late to actually respond to such a failure. Governing body. So this is an important one, where I said in the beginning, some companies use IT, some companies use business, some don't use anybody to govern. But ideally, we want to have a mix of tactical and strategic teams to govern your Power Platform. Under your tactical team, you have an operation committee. These are the guys who are going to keep the lights on. They determine, ownership, if there's any sort of maintenance that needs to be done. They monitor the health of it. Maybe more capacity needs to be purchased, maybe additional licenses. That's what your operational team is doing. Then you have your support team or committee. These are the ones who are going to be the front line, taking in the calls. If somebody's, let's say, building a workflow as a solution, it's not working, maybe there's an access issue, that's where the support committee comes in and it's going to help out. And then you have your strategic committee, and this is where you have your business members together with your IT members sit down and determine, where's the Power Platform today? How's it being used? How is it going to help the future vision and usage of the Power Platform? And then together, this is should be your Power Platform governing committee that you meet on a regular basis to understand what is happening, what is working, what isn't working, and how can we make it better for the future of the company. On to H. So HTTP triggers. When you build a workflow, there's different types of triggers available. One of them is an HTTP trigger. For those of you who are developers who are familiar with REST APIs, it's essentially an endpoint. So if somebody knows the URL, by default, they can make a call to this URL from anywhere. And depending on the behavior of the workflow, if it's a workflow that simply will return data based on the URL, then you may be in a situation where you're having data that's being leaked and you want to protect yourself. A couple ways to do that is one of them is actually introducing some sort of a token inside of the workflow that is going to be checked against the caller, and the caller is going to say, here's my token, double check, make sure that I'm legit. Another way to do this, actually a better way to do it, is using the Azure API management, which can restrict which tenant or which URL or domain is a workflow being called from. So even though it doesn't completely prevent somebody illegitimately calling it, at least you're restricting that illegitimate call to the specific domain. Integrations. So you can have a lot of different integrations with different systems using the connectors that are available. There's also many services out there. What you want to make sure from your company's point of view is that if you're going to be using a third-party solution, whether it's SaaS or on-prem, you want to make sure that whatever they do with the data, however they manage it and store it, is conforming to your company's guidelines and standard. So it's not really governance around the Power Platform, but it's really something you have to consider from a legal perspective. Again, suppose you're sitting in Europe and you're building a workflow and you want to use a connector that is going to do PDF processing. So there's an organization called Encodian, and they have really good solutions, but they're sitting in the US. So now you're sending data from Europe into the US. Are those terms and conditions acceptable? Now your European data is living in a US data center. So those are things you want to think about. JSON constraining. So if anybody has worked with connectors where or workflows where you're trying to essentially pass JSON data into a workflow or return data from a JSON workflow back into a Power App, you need to define the schema. And one of the things I love about the Power Automate, it has the ability to generate from sample code. So in other words, I can give it some sample JSON, it's going to generate the schema for me. But you have to be careful because sometimes when you do that, it generates over-constrained schemas. In other words, if I give it the value 1, it is going to assume that 1 is an integer. I may want it to be a floating point, a number. So I actually have to adjust the schema. If I give it a piece of text, it will assume that it is a required field because it has a value. So again, you may have to go into the schema and make some modifications there. Knowledge base. So you want to make sure that you provide your users with a healthy knowledge base on how to do things, combining the latest and greatest from the web, from the industry, together with your own best practices, your own standards. Make sure that you're reviewing that on a regular basis because things are changing. For example, a few months ago, a new type of licensing was introduced for Power Platform that is now making it less expensive for Power Apps if you're only using certain Power Apps occasional. Those are the kind of things that you want to notify your users about. On the topic of licensing. So this is easily a 2-hour conversation we can have, but the important part is review your licensing on a regular basis because licensing isn't cheap. Make sure that you understand what is out there, what is being used, what is not being used, and whether your licensing is adequate. There may be cases where you're getting too many licenses that are overkill, and you're spending extra money. There may be cases where users may eventually get blocked because you actually don't have enough capacity or enough licenses, and they just haven't used it yet. And the moment they try to use it, it's going to say, sorry, you're not licensed. So that's something to consider. Managing solutions. Think of solutions as a way to package your applications, your workflows, and how you're going to be moving them between different environments. And so there's two types of solutions, managed and unmanaged. By default, there are a number of managed solutions that are provided to you by Microsoft. As I said before, when you talk about Dataverse, and even let's say we talk about Dynamics 365 that is built on Dataverse, you have all these different entities and solutions that are coming to you with the system. So they're managed, which basically means you cannot modify the core, but you can make customizations on top of it. And so you as a user can start building your own managed solution on top of what is provided by Microsoft. So you can start with your solution 1.0. You can start doing patches on top of it, and then over time you can then roll all your patches together into a new version of a managed solution. The reason that I say that it's managed is because when you as a developer give a solution to a client or to your users, don't give them unmanaged solutions because users typically break stuff. So give them something that is managed, and then they can add their own unmanaged layer on top of it. And so this upstream process is something that is a best practice that you want to consider when you're building solutions for the Power Platform. In terms of access and security, so we talked about DLP policies a little bit earlier, but there's other ways for you to ensure or to limit the exposure of the Power Platform. Least privilege access. So the Power Platform will respect whatever permissions are granted. In other words, if I build a Power Platform that is supposed to read from a SharePoint list, if I share that Power App, let's say with Drew, and Drew doesn't have access to the SharePoint list, he can open up the app, but he's not going to see any data because he doesn't have access to it. So that's where it's important to remember that by just sharing apps and services, it's not enough. You want to provide access to the data itself, but make sure that you give the least amount of access necessary for the user to complete their work. Network access control and location-based conditional access, really what that's saying is there's ways to restrict where users are accessing your workflows or your solutions from, in terms of, are they inside the network, are they roaming somewhere, what kind of devices they're using. So again, just another way of controlling, adding more control on how things are being used. On-premise data gateways. So the gateways is a way for a user to get to on-prem data. I talked about the bots earlier, and the bots is really just building a solution that mimics user interaction. On-premise gateways is just a way for you to get to that SharePoint on-prem, or maybe a SQL Server, or maybe an SAP environment, a file share. Those are things that are not in the cloud that you want to get to. And so the gateways allows you to do it. And you can use them for Power Apps, for Power Automate, Power BI, but you want to make sure that when you're doing an assessment and you're governing your environment, who has gateways enabled? Where are they being installed? If somebody is installing a gateway on a laptop, it's not ideal because when they close that laptop, that gateway is shut down, and if somebody else needs to access the data, they can't. Is a gateway running on the same machine as one of the services that it's serving, for example, SharePoint? And so let's say that you have a server and it's SharePoint Tuesday, and you're shutting down your SharePoint server for maintenance. You've also taken your gateway offline. So again, this is where you want to think about having a dedicated environment for your gateway that can serve multiple systems. If it's mission critical, you probably want to set up a cluster of multiple gateways that work together. So if one goes down, it's gonna roll over to another gateway. Who is actually using it? Who has access to those gateways? So these are all the kind of questions that you want to ask yourself around the on-premise gateways. Provisioning. So with provisioning, you want to think about what kind of licenses are going to be used. Is there going to be an implication? Do you need another environment? Always think about the different scenarios of the, if I want to say, okay, if I'm going to say somebody's going to get access to an app or an environment, what are the implications overall to the organization from a cost, from a security, from all of these different elements? Okay, so you want to make sure that there's a process in place. It's not just to say, I need an environment. Okay, here you go. There's the considerations, the the kind of data. Is data going to be generated and needs to be secured? Any sort of retention policies, all of that. So when we talk about queries in Power Automate, so there are certain limits. With Power Apps, when you're calling a workflow, there's a 2-minute limit on returning from a Power Automate workflow back to a Power App. If it takes longer, it's going to time out. There's also a limit on the number of items that you can bring back. Typically, it's 2,000 items. There are creative ways of getting over that amount, but the more data that you're going to bring in, the slower it's going to get, and it's also going to slow down the actual processing of the Power App. And then from a Power Automate perspective, one of the limitations of the queries is around the timing. So there's a 30-day limit. You can extend it, but again, you have to architect a solution for that. And you got to also think about certain connectors. For example, if you're looking at an Excel document, there's a maximum number of rows that you can access. If you're looking at Dataverse or Dynamics and you want to pull data, it's going to pull by default 256 rows on a table. You can do more, but you have to set up paging. So things for you to be aware of so that you don't run into a situation where you're expecting more data, you're not getting it, but you're not seeing failures. It's just because it's giving you basically what's told to give you based on the queries. In terms of roles, so there's different roles defined in the Power Platform. So you have the global admin, which nobody should ever be using on a regular basis because that really opens up, it's the keys to the castle. Too risky. The Power Platform admin role, that is the highest one you can have for managing a Power Platform. This is the kind of an account you probably want to set up with PIM access, privileged identity management, so that users are only using it for a certain amount of time. And then if you're using Dynamics in your environment, you could also do a lot of the Power Platform configurations using the Dynamics 365 service account. And then for external consultants, you can use a delegate admins account to give them access to the Power Platform and other parts of the system. Sharing apps and flows. So again, I said before that when you share an app, you got to consider that the data sources themselves are actually not being shared automatically. So that's something you have to consider. Also, if you're sharing externally, you want to externally with guests, you got to consider the Azure B2B external collaboration licenses. And typically there's or at least I remember that there was a ratio of 5:1. So for every one licensed Microsoft 365 user, you get 5 guest user accounts. So that's something that you want to consider is how many external users you're going to have. They're going to be accessing your Power Platform solutions, and then also consider how they're going to be accessing the data sources behind. Technology debt. So I bet everybody on the call who's worked with the Power Platform, they start by going to the default environment, building out the first workflows and Power Apps, and then start using them, start sharing them with their teammates, their buddies, and everybody's happy. And then all of a sudden, there's another requirement. Let's make that a bit bigger, shared with another few people. Before you know it, you're going to have a department-wide or team-wide or even organization-wide solution that is deployed, but it's never been properly reviewed. There's no control over any sort of failures, any sort of checking, and that becomes a bit risky. And so what you want to do as part of your governance is set up a process for deploying solutions. If it's somebody who's building their own workflow and you're essentially saying, okay, that can't be shared with anybody, there's less of an impact. Still not ideal, but less of an impact if it doesn't work properly. But if you start building those bigger solutions, imagine you're building a solution to help with your payroll, right? Nobody wants that one to fail. Everybody wants their paycheck. So this is where you want to set up a application lifecycle management process where you start developing in developer environments. All the code goes into a code repository such as Azure DevOps. You then deploy the solution into a sandbox environment. It gets reviewed by the testers, the first round of testers, who are then looking for any potential issues in integration. Then you can go to the next level of deployment when everything works fine. And this is where you do your UAT testing, and you bring in your business users to do validation. And then after everything is said and done and everything works fine, then you deploy it into production. And that's where nobody is a maker. Only the admins or the developers can deploy the solution to production, and everybody else is just a general user of the solution. So again, you want to make sure that you are implementing these type of processes into your environment. With access, so this is a picture that tells a big story. You got to think about two elements here: access to the systems and access to the connectors. Okay, so if you look at it from a bottom up, this is where we can limit what type of connectors are available. So if you remember before, I talked about the DLP policies, and I said that ideally you don't want to give a lot of access to some users. There are cases where you do need to do that. And then if you go from left to right, you have your system barrier, and this is where you have to think about, okay, what systems do I have access to? In some cases, in most cases, it's going to be very limited. In some cases, it has to be more open. So your citizen developers are going to be sitting in the bottom left corner. They're going to have a few connectors, maybe those 23 that I mentioned initially, and they only have access to basic data, the teams that they belong to, their OneDrive, their Outlook mailbox, and maybe another few systems. Now, let's say that you have somebody in marketing. They have a legitimate reason that they need to use other connectors. So they may have access to certain internal connectors and systems, and they also need to go to access social media to promote the company. So they're the ones who are moving to the top left, where now they can have additional connectors, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever it might be, to help build automation for those specific purposes. Let's look at the flip side. There may be limited connector access. Let's say we're talking about SharePoint, we're talking about some databases, but rather than an individual just having access to their own, let's say that you have somebody who is working in the analytics department who needs to create reports for management that says, across all the different regions, all the different sales offices, I want to generate some Power BI reports with all the numbers. Those are individuals who are still restricted in terms of the connectors, but now have access to more systems. So those are the individuals who are sitting in the bottom right. And then you have the top right corner box, which is going to be either your IT or developers, and that's where they have access to essentially, I don't want to say all the systems and all the connectors, but there has to be control in place to give them additional access as they need it. With virtual agents, really not too much to say about governance, but one thing you want to do is you want to monitor the usage of your bots. They're not cheap, so definitely you want to make sure that you're getting most bang for your buck. And monitor the usage, monitor the success rates. How many calls are being escalated to a person? How many conversions do you have if you're using them for any sort of sales or other types of transactions, right? Are people getting the answers that they want? How quickly are they getting to the answers? So that's what you can do with the virtual agents. Workflows. Okay, so you can create your workflows very easily. There's a lot of templates available, thousands of templates, but you got to ask yourself, and this happens again. You see it all the time. You start doing an assessment, and next thing you know, you start seeing all these like tests, test here and test there, and test workflows and workflows that have the same name but slightly different with different version numbers. So when you're looking at your workflows, you're trying to do an assessment. You should be doing an assessment on a regular basis or monitor it to say, how many workflows do we have? Who's using them? Are they failing? What kind of systems are they accessing? Are the connectors working or are the connectors broken? So there's all these questions you want to ask yourself about your workflows. And the last one is exception handling. And so when you're building workflows, and again, this is something I see very often where you build a workflow for the what I call the happy path. Everything is fine. You have all your data sources, all of my connections are working. Everything is good. But what if something is not good? What if you're trying to you build a workflow to calculate the number of vacation days left, and all of a sudden somehow you're ending up with a negative number? The whole workflow fails. By default, if that workflow is, and let's say it's a company-wide workflow, that workflow is owned by a service account, ideally. And so the service account is going to get an email once every couple of days. In the meanwhile, the application request process is broken, right? So if somebody is waiting for an approval, it's never going to go. The person is getting frantic, right? They're supposed to buy their tickets. So that can cause a lot of issues. And so what you want to do is, ideally, every time you build a workflow, you want to build the proper resilience into it. And so for those developers on the call, it's what is called a try, catch, finally block, right? Where you put your core functionality into the try block or the try scope. You try different things. If there's any failure, you go into the catch block. And this is where you can, for example, send a notification, maybe an email, raise a ServiceNow ticket, do whatever you have to do in the workflow. And then in the finally is, regardless of whether the try worked or the catch worked, you finally does the final cleanup. So in a workflow, the first thing you want to do is, are my connections good? Is the data that I'm getting of the right format? Are all the values that I'm expecting to process there or not? You want to do all of those checks in your try block before you actually process or modify any systems. It's much easier to just say, this workflow failed. Okay, no problem. We can reinitiate the workflow and pass it some information, and now it's going to run properly, versus, okay, it just fallen off the rail. There's nothing we can do with it. So that's something that you should consider. And if you think back earlier when I talked about the knowledge base for the company, your application lifecycle management process, you want to build some templates for your workflow so that if any citizen developer or anybody else is going to build something, they're going to have a starting point that is going to be a healthy starting point for building solutions. For workflows, again, it's building that kind of resiliency. For Power Apps, it can be building maybe some general branding and some responsiveness. So those are things you want to think about. I'm going to open it up to questions now. I know I was kind of flying through this material really fast. I apologize. But questions?
First, just thank you. It's a lot of information, but you're definitely hitting all the things we see too in our world, and what you have to understand at some level as you kind of get into it overall. And a lot of people do. We're seeing the same thing where people start with no governance, and then have to kind of clean that up over time. But it was a great overview of all the different components that people run into. So appreciate it.
A pleasure.
All right.
If anybody's interested, I just put a link here. Shameless plug, but at Protiviti we actually have we call it a Power Platform assessment. So this is something that you can look up and just to kind of get a sense generally of what it would entail. But also you see my information if anybody has any other questions around how to do an assessment, what's involved in the governance, the slide I was talking about earlier on the whole process. Please feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah. Thank you. Did anyone else have any other stories or any kind of examples of what they're doing in their organization around Power Platform to kind of put some guardrails on it, or not? If you do, please share now.
I don't know. Were there any questions that were posted on the chat? I don't see it.
No.
Okay.
All right. Well, then I will just end here today with where we started. So again, thank you, Haniel, for going through all that. It was great overall. So Next meeting for this group, our May event is on the 18th. So just a reminder, that's our event. It's going to be afternoon instead of the morning. So we're going to tweak that a little bit. So please save that on your calendar if you want to attend, because we're going to be in person in the Brookfield, Pewaukee area. In the Milwaukee side and online. So we'll have both options available specifically to experience a hybrid meeting on both sides of it if you want. But our gracious hosts at AVI Systems, they have rooms set up to show the technology in these Teams rooms set up, and a great experience to be in a hybrid meeting. And then from there, we'll look at other solutions too that go with hybrid work and kind of the new world where people are half in the office, half not, and that could change each and every day. So other than that, thank you everyone for your time today. We'll end a little early, and I'll get this video posted. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.